few years ago, one Serb enemy had online temper tantrum and he said, "Of course Serbs like to kill because they follow God of Death." At first I didn't know what he was talking about. What God of Death? And then he mentioned Veselin Trajanovic and I immediately understood. Trajanovic was an esteemed Serb scholar. He was philosopher, ethnologist, religious history scholar, among other things. I have to point out that Trajanovic died in 1946, so his opinions are considered outdated. What's up with Trajanovic and God of Death? Serbs don't know who was supreme deity when Serbs were pagans. Serb scholars have different theories about who might he be. Trajanović's theory was that the main deity was God of Death or God of Underworld. Was Trajanović right? We don't know. I will start from the beginning. Serbs have no written documents or books about their early history. We don't even know where Serb original homeland was. We know that Serbs were pagans when they moved to the Balkans in 7th century AD. It is unclear how many gods Serbs worshipped and who they were. Today scholars know more about Roman and Greek gods than about Slavic gods. Slavs are a group of peoples who speak Slavic languages. Slavs are divided into East Slavs, West Slavs, and South Slavs. There are no North Slavs. South Slavs, include Serbs, accepted Christianity before East Slavs and West Slavs did. As a result, we know more about pagan deities worshipped by East and West Slavs. Did South Slavs worship the same gods like East and West Slavs? We are not sure. Interestingly, all Slavic nations use the same word for God: bog. In English, bog means marsh or swamp. The Slavic word bog comes from Persian language, according to some theories. The next question is how close Slavs were. There are two main theories about Slav origin. All Slavs belonged to one tribe that branched out. Slavs were a confederation of tribes that had little in common. I think truth is probably somewhere in between. Why would unrelated tribes speak similar languages? There had to be at least some connection. Slavs are first mentioned in historical sources in 6th century AD. This would mean that South Slavs left the hypothetical confederation rather early. If all Slavs belong to one tribe, then it is reasonable to assume that they all worshipped the same supreme god. However, if Slavs were a confederation of unrelated tribes, then it is reasonable to assume that each tribe had their own supreme god. We know very little about early Slavic identity. Modern Slavs are ethnically and culturally diverse. Pan-Slavism was the idea that all Slavs should unite. It is possible that Pan-Slavists in 19th century exaggerated similarities between Slavs. It is possible that Pan-Slavists invented some Slavic deities to fill in the gaps. Most scholars today believe that main Slavic deity was Perun, god of sky, thunder, lightning. He would be similar to Greek Zeus and Roman Jupiter. The 6th century historian Procopius mentioned that Slavs believe in a god of thunder. Procopius was Christian, so he wouldn't write much about pagan deities. Procopius didn't say how this god of thunder was named. The name Perun comes from Russian sources from 10th century. South Slavs did know about Perun. Serbs use the name Perunica for flower Iris germanica. Another name for this flower is bogisha, which derives from word bog. What were Čekanović's reasons to believe that god of death was supreme Serb deity? Čekanović admitted that he had no strong evidence for his theory. He wrote a book called About the Supreme God in the Old Serbian Religion, published in 1941. He believed that Dabog or Dažbog or Dajbog was the supreme god. Čekanović believed that when Serbs accepted Christianity, they had to degrade their supreme pagan god to devil. Famous demon mentioned in Serbian folklore is named Daba. Dabog, Daba. Čekanović mentions medieval names like Dapiša and Daboje as evidence that Dabog Daba was celebrated. There are also toponyms like village Dabići in Čajetina municipality. Čekanović also mentions modern last names like Dabić and Dabović. However, he ignores that medieval Serbs didn't have family names. Serbs had patronymic last names. Serb nobleman Mladen had a son Branko Mladenović and grandson Vuk Branković. This means that modern last names Dabić and Dabović originate from ancestor nicknamed Daba. The name Dabog Dajbog consists of words da daj, which means give in Serbian, and bog, god. He would be giving god. There is no evidence that Dabog and Demon Daba were the same, though names are similar. Because of this idea, Serb enemies claim how Serbs are devil worshippers. Čekanović believed that Saint Sava replaced Dabog in Serbian folklore. Saint Sava founded Serbian Orthodox Church in 1219. There are many folk tales about Saint Sava. He is often depicted as friendly with wolves. Wolf was Serbian tribal animal. Wolves in mythology are associated with death. Wolves would be companions to god of death. The problem is that folk stories were written down only in the 19th century, long after Serbs became Christians. We don't know what early folk stories talked about. The major problem with Čekanović's theory is that Dabog wasn't considered god of death. Dabog is described as god of sun, solar deity, and his father is Svarog. Svarog is god of fire who created the sun, Dabog. Čekanović had vast knowledge about mythology, and he mixed facts and created very weak theory. In his book, Čekanović mentions some Gaul traditions. Gauls were Celtic tribes in France. They are best known for Caesar's book Gallic Wars, and the comic books, movies about Asterix and Obelix. Serbs had no contact with Gauls. This means that we shouldn't care what Gauls did. Čekanović often mentions Germanic god Woden and says that Woden and Dabog are the same. Woden had wolf companions. Woden is god of war, not god of death. Čekanović compares German folk stories with Serbian and finds many similarities. He mentions wolves, magic cape, magic shoes, magic horses, sacrificing animals. But these are common details that can be found all over the world. Sacrificing animals to please gods can be found in almost every ancient culture. Čekanović also overlooked important detail. In 13th century, Serbian King Uroš decided to open mines and start mining. He had no experience with mining, so he decided to call someone who knew what to do. He invited Saxons to come to Serbia. Saxons were one of Germanic tribes. Saxons were famous for mining. Some Saxons did come to Serbia, but we don't know how many. As a result of Uroš's actions, there were Saxon villages in Serbia. It is very likely that Serbs heard stories about Vodin from Saxons. This would mean that all hypothetical similarities between Vodin and Sensava originate from 13th century and not before. Čekanović also mentions Romani traditions. Roma used to work as blacksmiths, since Serbs didn't like that particular profession. Roma blacksmiths would travel from village to village and fix things. Čekanović claims that the profession of blacksmith is connected to the underworld. Hephaestus is the Greek god of blacksmiths. Hephaestus was lame and demon Daba was also lame. I see no real connection. Then Čekanović claims that Serbs used to have human sacrifices. He based this theory on traditions connected to Vodin. Čekanović claims that Serbs had tradition to pour animal blood into river. Personally, I never heard of such tradition. He then mentions dark traditions from eastern Serbia. Ethnic group named Vlachs live in eastern Serbia. They are not Slavs. Romanians claim that Vlachs are in fact Romanians. Ethnic stereotype is that Vlachs love dark magic that includes bones and blood. Vlah witchcraft is still popular in Serbia. However, these dark rituals have nothing to do with Dabog. Next, Čekanović says that all important Serbian religious holidays fall in winter. And winter is time of death. First, Sensava is celebrated in January and St. Nicola in December because that's when they died. St. Jovan John the Baptist has several feast days over the year. All Orthodox Christians celebrate Archangel Mihailo in November. More importantly, St. George, Serbian George, and Prophet Elias, Serbian Ilya, are celebrated in May and August, which are not winter months. Čekanović mentions how Egyptian supreme deity Osiris was god of death. True, but he has nothing to do with Serbs. Čekanović mentions prophecies from Kremna. The Kremna prophecies originated in the village of Kremna in Serbia. Illiterate villager Miloš Tarabić and his nephew Mitar Tarabić built a reputation for predicting the future. Their village Serbian Orthodox priest Zaharije Zaharić is said to have recorded their predictions. Both Tarabićs died before 1900. Today, scholars reject prophecies from Kremna as total hoax. There are several versions of the prophecies. Čekanović would be ridiculed today for taking Kremna prophecies seriously. He mentions how prophecies talk how Savior will arrive on white horse and the Savior will be lame. And the golden age will start. Side note, Tito during World War II rode white horse and Tito was lame later in life. Many describe Tito's era as golden age. What do I think about Čekanović's theory about god of death? I think he was wrong. There is no proof that Dabog was the supreme god. There is no proof that Dabog was god of death. There is no proof about human sacrifices. I think it is more likely that Perun was the supreme god. Dabog was probably one of the deities. I find it appalling that Čekanović's theory is used by Serbophobes to depict Serbs as wicked. Some Serbs do love to kill, but this is not national trait. And we are certainly not killing our enemies to please God of death.